Thank you very much. I just wanted to start by reflecting on the evidence we heard in Brisbane at a Senate inquiry of this committee into aircraft noise. I'm sure many of you, some of you, followed or have seen that evidence. Suffice to say, Airservices Australia came in for a bit of a beating that day. Pretty much all groups, one of the only things that all groups agreed on was that the planning, the implementation of the second runway by Airservices Australia had been severely lacking. Can I ask you to reflect on that evidence, and has or was, in your view, Mr Harfield or others, the performance of Airservices Australia lacking in regards to planning for the second runway for the Brisbane airport?
Senator, before I ask Mr Curran to sort of add some further, because he's a bit more close to it than I have in the sense of the committee, the hearing, we have been on the record, and also with the Noise Ombudsman review, there were areas that in the period of time in doing the consultation as a result of and the flight path design with the new Brisbane runway, there were mistakes made, and for multiple different reasons, the length of time, plus also lack of documentation and a range of issues, and fully acceptive of all of that. That is one of the reasons why that when the post-implementation review came, that we engaged Tracks International to come in and provide an independent review of all the work that was being done so that we could actually continue to improve. Some of the accusations and things that are levelled against their services I don't accept, in the sense of is that we do not build the runway, we do not attract the aircraft, and the fact is that we have to manage the demand on the airport. So there is a sort of a range of things, except absolutely criticism that our performance wasn't as great. However, not all of those I'm willing to accept, but I'll ask Mr Curran to...
Thank you. Senator, yes, I certainly listened to, I would say, the vast majority of the testimony in Brisbane, and have read the submissions, nearly all of them, I think, in detail. I've certainly gone over all of the submissions that have been made to date. Airservices has learned an incredible amount through the Brisbane parallel runway implementation. Mr Harfield's touched on some of them, I think, building on that a little bit. We certainly invest significantly more in community engagement now than we did a number of years ago, bearing in mind that process started in 2007 and the runway didn't go live until July 2020. But certainly we've taken the view, one of the key learnings is to work with airports far more closely throughout the whole life of these significant programs. To ensure that the community engagement meets the standard to which we will be held to account for. The Aircraft Noise Ombudsman holds us to a standard of the airports and other stakeholders beyond defence, so not within the remit of the Aircraft Noise Ombudsman. And so we're very clear around the standard that we're held to and that we should be held to. And so we seek to work with airports to ensure that we will get to that standard. We've taken an incredible amount of learnings out of that to apply to other environments, Western Sydney, Melbourne, Perth, and the like, in the way that we design flight paths, the way that we engage communities, and things like the community engagement standard that we now commit to and engage communities on the basis of that are some good examples of the learnings we've taken.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Thanks for the admission. I mean, I suppose my biggest concern after the day, though, was not the lack of consultation, notwithstanding it's a very important issue too, but it's just basic things haven't been done that seem to have been or should have been in your remit. For example, there was evidence that that the runways, the evidence provided to us was that the runways are still not operating in what was described to us as in an independent way. That apparently the two runways, and correct me if any of this is wrong, I'm going on what was told to me, but the runways were built to be far enough apart such that, particularly I think during this sod drops stuff, they could be run independently. But apparently it's not the case. Apparently, due to the fact there hasn't been an updates to flight paths or instrumentation or regulations or something, I don't know. Apparently that's not possible. And I was just checking. This is evidence provided to us by Brisbane Airport Corporation. It wasn't from local constituents or some such. These are presumably people who know what they're talking about, and they're complaining that thanks to delays on your end, they actually can't run. The two airstrips they've built, spent a lot of money building, they can't run them independently as designed.
Senator, it is correct that as at today, the independent mode of operation is not available at Brisbane. For context on why that is the case, firstly, the independent runway mode is our most high-capacity mode. It can deliver around 72 flights per hour. Today we're operating at a level less than that, probably closer to 50. The demand at Brisbane is also not at and nowhere near 72 flights per hour. So the introduction of the independent mode will allow for significantly more flights over Brisbane City, and so it is not a noise sharing mode, it is a capacity throughput mode. That's not been introduced primarily because of the length of the program. When the independent mode was designed, was somewhere between 2007 and 2018, CASA, the Civil Aviation Safety Authority, updated standards in relation to independent operations to reflect international practice, and that meant the design that we had earlier done was no longer valid. We're going through the process of actually looking to implement that mode.
Sorry, when was CASA? When was that CASA?
I haven't got the exact date here as to when it happened. It was prior to the, beg your pardon, it was following the final design. The note I have here is due to a change to a CASA mandated procedure following final design. I think final design occurred in about 2018.
It was a long time ago. Yep, okay.
So there is a requirement to update that design, and the intention is to do that in the course of late next year. Again, we don't assess, and I believe nor does Brisbane Airport assess, that the forecasts for traffic demand will reach anything like 72 per hour in the course of next year.
There's a lot more questions from your evidence, but okay, let's start with that one. You claim that this independent operation only impacts capacity. I'll just read you some of the transcript from Brisbane. I asked Mr Boyle from the Brisbane Airports Corporation, can you just pinpoint what they have done, what have Airservices Australia done or not done that hasn't allowed sod drops to increase? Big topic of the hearing you might have seen was the fact that despite promises made before the second runway, the share of flights operating over the bay had not increased. In fact, it basically stayed the same. Mr Boyle said that the airspace is designed to operate in a variety of different modes. I'll talk about two key areas. One is that the runways can operate dependent, so you have to consider aircraft on the other one, or they can operate independently. The system is designed to be operated independently. At this stage, we have not moved to independent operations, which allows for much better noise outcomes for the community, because Airservices Australia has not implemented that. I mean, are you disagreeing with Mr Boyle then, that you're saying that independent operations has nothing to do whether sod drops can occur or not?
Could you say that again? Nothing to do with sod props, did you say?
Sod drops occurring or being able to be run on.
Senator, sod props is quite a different piece, and I'm familiar with Mr Boyle's evidence. I don't believe he mentioned sod props in that context. The two
I just read it out. It was a direct... I asked him directly, what has Airservices Australia done or not done that hasn't allowed sod drops to increase? And he said, first thing he said was what I just read out, that they can't operate the runways independently.
Sorry, Senator. The independent operations is a high capacity mode where we are operating either both runways in a northerly direction or both runways in a southerly direction. Sod props is a procedure, as I think we've mentioned previously, where we operate over the bay, Senator. There are a range of improvements that we are making and need to continue to make as it relates to sod props. I fully agree with the evidence of BAC in that regard, but we do not see the high-capacity mode of independent parallel runway operations as a noise-sharing mode.
Sod props. It's completely different from what Brisbane Airport Corporation is saying, and I can't just try to explain to me in layman's terms, because it's very hard for us, obviously.
Senator,
why is Mr Ball wrong? And your evidence clearly is that he's wrong. Why is he wrong?
Senator, the best explanation I can offer you is that independent operations, independent parallel operations, are a mode, in general terms, where we will be doing arrivals either to the north or arrivals to the south to both parallel runways simultaneously. And the aircraft, the runways, as you said before, are far enough space that we can run them almost like they're two separate airports from an air traffic control perspective. We can have the flights side by side, if you will, and that's safe to do so. Today, that mode is not available. That is a high capacity mode. What we run today is a dependent mode of operations, which means we need to... Which means we need to see...
Obviously...
He's blaming you for not being able to run the high capacity.
One at a time.
Obviously, when you run the sod drops mode and you're running, my understanding is that in that case, aircraft would be taking off and landing over Moreton Bay. My understanding is that because they're doing that effectively over the same airspace, that sod drops can only be turned on at times of relative low capacity. Is that right?
Senator, that's correct.
Okay. So if you had two separate runways, wouldn't you be able to turn on sod drops at a higher capacity level?
Senator, the sod props procedure is not related to the independent parallel runway operations.
No, that's not what I asked. That's just reasserting what you just said earlier. Explain to me why, if we had two separate runways that run independently, we could then do this sod drops at a high capacity level than what we currently do.
Senator, we can't because...
What's stopping you?
Senator, the capacity...
Let's answer the question. All right, we'll come back.
The capacity limitation on sod prop centre is that we have an aircraft arriving onto one runway at the same time as we have it departing off the other runway. That is the complexity.
Aren't the runways far enough apart that that's not an issue?
For sod props, that's not the point. The issue around them being far enough apart is when they are both moving in the same direction to land in the same direction or depart in the same direction. Sod props, we are having aircraft arrive on one runway and depart off the other runway in the opposite direction to each other. And so it is a low capacity mode. The Brisbane Airport EIS always stated that, and we're a little bit lower than where we would like to be in terms of what we can manage on a per hourly basis, and we're not running...
A little bit lower. You haven't changed. Hasn't changed. Anyway, we'll come back to this at future hearings, because I don't quite understand. I think the evidence from some of these witnesses is very clear. Your evidence is clear as mud. On the other point, then,
my two cents there is that when we're talking about the capacity reference, the opposite direction operations isn't about runway capacity; it's the airspace capacity because we're pointing aeroplanes at each other.
Sure, but
that's where the constraint comes. It's not about runway capacity. That's all.
It's obviously one factor. Why has it taken? What will it take? You're saying this won't be complete till next year. Why has it taken 7 years? You said the CASA changes were back in 2018. It's taken 7 years to... I mean, the runway probably would have been built within 7 years. Why has it taken that long?
Senator, we worked with Brisbane Airport Corporation over the last number of years since runway opening to agree a point at which Airservices would implement the independent parallel runway operations, and it has been agreed that we will do that next year, and that's driven around a couple of factors, but primarily because it will enable much higher number of aircraft to arrive over Brisbane City in any given hour, and that hasn't been needed for operations today. There's some complexity as it relates to infrastructure at Brisbane Airport, where Brisbane Airport have made clear to us that in fact they don't need the mode this year. Next year they estimate they do need it, and we've committed to delivering it in the back end of next year.
That's amazing.
It's actually
so later on in the evidence, not that later on, but a little later on, Mr Boyle said that they anticipated that under the sod drops mode would be able to do 40 movements per hour, whereas at the moment the maximum they can do is 15, maybe 20 movements per hour. And directly, Mr Boyle, directly quoting him, he says, again, there are some procedural changes that are required to the flight paths and some staffing constraints that have met that it cannot be yet introduced. So why haven't we got a situation where this sod drops mode can go up to the 40 movements per hour?
Senator, there's some complexity with the sod props mode that we're working through. The EIS forecast that we'd be able to move approximately 40 per hour, and it is correct that we are closer to 20 per hour today, and that's due to some of the airspace design that sits around that. There are flight paths into Sunshine Coast, over Moreton Bay and into Gold Coast that conflict with this, which make it difficult to run during higher demand periods. So we use sod props during night time and lower demand periods. It's also the case that that's when it's arguably, Senator, most valuable. It's a sensitive time of night, sensitive time of day for communities. We've been working toward extending the use of sod props since the runway, parallel runway went live in July 2020. Some statistics to give you a sense of how we're going and where our challenge still remains. In 2023, we ran sod props for 8%, approximately 8% of all operational hours. We assess that weather and traffic mean that we could have potentially run it for between 11 and 13% of the time. So we see opportunity to extend the hours in which we currently deliver sod props, and we need to do that through working with our teams, through making procedural adjustments and also some airspace changes. We've also looked at whether or not to extend the use of sod props we could adjust the criteria around tailwind and explored an increase.
I'm going to come back to that. Let's not get diverted. So when will these flight paths be redesigned?
We plan the flight paths to be redesigned in the course of next year, but we will be increasing sod props through procedural processes later this year in July 2024. We plan to increase sod props from Friday at 10 p.m. To Saturday at 10 a.m. And then again sod props from 10 a.m. Saturday until 4 p.m. Sunday. That will give sod props is, if you will, flight for flight, the best noise outcome for Brisbane communities, which is why we're so focused on it, as are Brisbane Airport, to deliver better outcomes and for some sense of what we achieve when we do that. For every sod props flight that takes place, we overfly a minimum of 286,000 fewer members of our community at a level of 60 decibels, and 23,000 fewer population are overflown at 70 decibels. So it's clearly a very beneficial mode, and that's what we're working a way to do, removing these procedural and operational restrictions. But we have to do it safely, Senator. We have to make sure that we don't compromise safety.
So, just going back to this issue of the independent runway, it's just occurred to me as we've been talking. I'm struggling to understand here. The promise that was made to people of the Brisbane community was that having a second runway would allow over-the-bay flights to occur more regularly. But now you're saying that to operate this over-the-bay mode, the sod props mode, so-called sod props mode, we don't need two runways because they don't have to operate independently. How does that make sense? Why couldn't we have just done this before the second runway? Or could we have?
So
People hoodwinked.
I'm afraid there's an incorrect assumption I think you're holding there. When we run a simultaneous opposite direction parallel runway mode, we are using both runways. We are arriving aircraft onto one runway from over the bay and departing on the other runway over the bay. And so we are using both runways, Senator.
Right, but they're not operating independently.
No, Senator, and nor can they for the sod props mode. This was the point I was trying to make before. There is an independent mode, Senator, and that is an independent parallel runway operations. Sod props doesn't operate independently, as Mr Harfield pointed to, because of complexity in the airspace, I beg your pardon.
When was the EIS approved for the second runway?
My recollection was 2007. I think it's
2007.
The EIS was approved around.
And in that EIS, they said we want to get to 40.
Senator, that's
40 movements per hour. You said earlier that was in the EIS.
That's correct,
40
yes.
movements per hour. So we're looking at taking potentially. You said next year you'll finalise this. 19 years.
Senator, we're making
19 years. To make the changes that were approved in 2007.
Senator, we commenced detailed design. We commenced detailed design in about 2016. The runway went live in 2020.
That table up.
There needs to be a class action on this. I mean, I don't want to put the Commonwealth's balance sheet at risk, but that is unbelievable.
Let's get back to questions.
People can't sleep.
Let's get back to questions, Senator Canavan. Thank you. Thank you.
My
Let's
kids
get
will have
back to
gone through
questions.
school in shorter
If we've
time.
got no other questions, we can release the
Oh,
witness.
we've got plenty of questions.
All right, well, let's get back to questions.
So,
Come on.
as I flagged, we might go to the tailwinds issue. I noticed that there has been a safety case from 5 knots to 7 knots has been approved. Is that right?
No, Senator, it was not.
How come then? Isn't there was an article in Aviation Australia? Let me pull it up. Which claimed that Singapore Airlines, Emirates, and Cathay Pacific were going to operate by flying into Brisbane Airport at 7 knots an hour. Is that
Senator, there is a
Not right.
trial that's being undertaken.
trial? Okay, right.
But there are two very important separate elements here, Senator, if I may. The first is a safety case relating to the rule set that air traffic controllers must adhere to, which is determined by the Civil Aviation Safety Authority, and that is around runway nomination as it relates to, in this case, downwind. The second matter, which is the trial you've just referred to, is whether or not aircraft and pilots and airlines may operate with greater than a 5-knot tailwind. Pilots and airlines have the ability to make a determination to operate at greater than 5 knots tailwind if they choose, and they go through appropriate safety processes. The limitation is that the rule set for air traffic controllers does not allow us to nominate a runway where there would be greater than 5 knots of downwind. Right. So practically, Senator, what that means is at sensitive times of day, airlines such as the ones you've just mentioned can request to operate off a runway that air traffic controllers wouldn't be able to normally nominate because they are participating in this trial with BAC. During those low traffic periods, it's typically the case that we can then accommodate a change in runway direction and manage that, and that gets better outcomes for the community of Brisbane.
Right. Okay. So, what's the status of this? Sorry, I thought this article, the safety case, had been approved. What's the status of the safety case?
So we're working with. So we submitted a safety case to CASA in the course of last year. CASA said that they weren't satisfied with that. We've been working with BAC, and this trial is a BAC initiative to gather more data so that we can look to provide additional information for CASA to consider whether or not they're prepared to change the air traffic control rule set to allow for a 7-knot downwind at Brisbane.
You might have seen that some of the pilots were scathing of the proposal.
Yeah.
Some of them claim they hadn't been consulted, although that seemed to be disputed later. What's the status there of that? Have
Senator,
pilots been consulted about this proposed change?
Senator, we are consulting. This is very much a change that impacts pilots and airlines, and so we are absolutely engaging in consultation with airlines domestic and international. And I think your comment there goes to the heart of some of the challenge that we have with this issue. In terms of delivering better community outcomes by using a particular runway.
When did you last meet with the pilots?
I'd have to check on the timing of that. We've been speaking.
You said international and domestic airlines. When did you last discuss this with international airlines?
I'll have to take that on notice, Senator. We've
when
been
did you
working.
last discuss this with domestic airlines?
It would be in the last number of weeks, Senator.
Okay, on notice, I would like a full list.
Thank you.
You come in and make flippant remarks that you've heavily consulted with pilots.
Senator.
And we ask the pilots and they say they're not consulted with. So I would like to see the hard data
All right, but before we do that,
tells us the dates and who you met with. Thank you.
To be fair to the witness, I don't think he's coming in here to making flippant remarks, and I don't think that's
It's not our first rodeo at this conversation.
Look, I don't think that's appropriate language to be used in this forum. But
rodeos
he's
in
taken.
the RAC committee.
I think you should just, be a bit more mindful of the language used. But was there anything else that you needed to add, Mr. Curran?
I was simply making the observation, Senator. I think the evidence that I heard given at the Brisbane public hearing for the noise inquiry, and as mentioned just by Senator Canavan, goes exactly to the heart of the issue, that the different perspectives on how Airservices best balance out what are competing interests around where we place flight paths and how we manage airspace, and we seek to strike that right balance. But it is challenging. There are a range of different views.
Right, we've got plenty of time.
Okay.
All right, we'll follow up with CASA on the safety case. Just turning now to I think what has been colloquially termed the full runway trial. Does that make sense?
Yes, Senator.
Take-off, landing trial. there's a lot of, you would have seen a lot of criticism of that from a variety of witnesses, that in fact, when that trial was done, the what was referred to as height markers for pilots were not adjusted. So their actual, apparently their ascent and I presume descent pathways didn't change despite potentially using the full runway. So therefore it wasn't surprising there wasn't a significant change in noise. Do you have a response to that issue? Do you understand what I'm putting to you there?
I am familiar with the trial, and we undertook the trial, I think it was 2022. At the time, that trial was requested to be initiated by the then BAPAF group, the Brisbane Airport Advisory Forum. It was considered a genuine option to implement quickly, where we may be able to get some benefit for communities. And in very plain terms, Senator, what we did was not allow aircraft to operate from an intersection and insist that they direct them to use the full runway.
Yes.
That practically meant that aircraft had about 250 metres more runway that they would take off from. The theory being that they would then take off earlier and be higher across the first communities in Brisbane. In general terms, that's what happened. It wasn't by enough to be perceptible. We had a noise monitor that recorded all of that. And in general terms, it was around a 1 decibel difference. We produced...
Can I just get you to come back to the question? I know all that. That was all discussed. What I asked about were the height markers changed.
The height markers were not changed, Senator. Aircraft are cleared above them.
Yeah, but this is the point that many were making, including the pilots, that meant there was no real difference from... there was never going to be a noise difference because they were still hitting the same point in the sky despite using the full runway.
Senator, I listened to the evidence of Qantas at Brisbane, and I think they were quite clear around the way that they managed their engines in terms of whether or not they actually took off any earlier or not. The height marker is aircraft are cleared above that height marker. It's the minimum altitude that they need to be at, and so the aircraft were above that height marker. And as we learned through that process,
so they were above it.
Yes, that's right, Senator.
How do you know they were above it?
Because we monitored their altitude and the noise associated with it.
Well, they're claiming they didn't, and the pilots just hit that marker. How many... Okay, go...
Senator, I recall the evidence that was given specifically that is the lowest altitude that you can be at. They are cleared to a higher altitude, and I think 3,300 is the altitude to the marker. Can you,
on notice, get us some data about how many flights, what percentage of flights were above that marker? Particularly, was there a baseline? Did you say, okay, before the trial, this was the flight path of flights, and then after the trial, this was the path? What was the difference?
Senator, we didn't have the noise monitor.
What was the...
Wow.
We didn't have the...
You said you collected it. You say you did.
We did not have the noise.
One at a time.
You do collect this data, but you don't.
Hang on there, Mr. Curran. I mean, seriously, just one at a time.
Senator, we didn't have the noise monitor.
Hang on.
Let's do a research project.
You know, I don't think it's helpful. Everyone's just yelling on top of each other. All right, Senator Canavan.
Well, you said you collect the data. Do you have that data?
Senator, yes, we do. We'll provide that on notice. The point I was making is we didn't know ahead of time that we were going to do this trial, and so we didn't have a noise monitor sitting in this particular location.
This is not about a noise monitor, though. This was about assessing whether there'd been, because I think the issue here, at least from your evidence I'm taking away, is there was nothing obliging the airlines to hit a higher ascent. They just could. And so how do we know they did or not? That's the question. So to what extent did they?
We can provide you that data on notice.
Okay. Now, just maybe, I think Senator Payne might have asked about this. I was only listening to part of it. Just continuous descent operations. Did she ask about that? Or?
Yes, Senator, she did.
Yeah, right. Okay. I might just go and leave room. We've got other hearings, so I'll let that one go. And look, finally, what concerned me perhaps most was something totally separate, but Brisbane Airport obviously have a strong growth strategy. The modelling they present to us seemed to indicate, it's a bit vague, but seemed to indicate they're potentially going to increase night flights by 5 times. When I put that to them, they said, yeah, that sounds about right. Later they had to correct that. But they're still growing, even on their corrected figures. They apparently currently do about 50 flights a night. over Brisbane that is projected to grow by 2040 to 87. Do you have any ability to regulate that? I mean, I don't think it'd be great to go to a curfew, but I'm not so sure complete unrestricted nighttime flights are what the Brisbane people thought the airport would do. So what's your ability at the moment to regulate how much of nighttime is used? Putting not a curfew, just can you say, look, that's unreasonable?
Senator, Airservices' role is not to regulate the capacity of airports in any way. Our role there would be to seek to minimise the impact on communities as far as practicable, and the way we would do that is to maximise that mode we were talking at length about before, simultaneous opposite direction parallel runway operations, to the extent that we can ensure, with weather and traffic permitting, we operate over the bay. That is the greatest mode for alleviation of noise for communities in Brisbane.
Although, doesn't you operate under the Airservices Act, right?
Yes, Senator.
Doesn't the Airservices Act say that there needs to be a consideration of the impact on communities of noise or something like that? I'm just trying to find
Senator, yes, that's correct. There is.
So I realise, look, I'm not trying to put you in a difficult position. I think if we're going to do something like this, it probably has to come from government, not from yourselves. But I'm just not sure what you said is quite correct. You're saying you don't have a role in that. The Act itself has an overall objective here to ameliorate the impact on communities, and clearly significant flights at night time will have a big impact on communities. So why can't you look at something like that?
Senator, because when the approvals are put in place, the EIS, the planning process that goes through, is approved by government, relevant ministers, and that sets a forecast, and essentially that's a permission to grow in that particular way. Airservices doesn't have any mechanisms to restrict the growth of airports. We provide services to the aviation industry, and so the way that we give effect to the paragraph you've called out in our Act is through the tools we do have, which is flight path design, when we seek and the operation of those flight paths, and we seek to minimise the impacts on communities by designing flight paths that overfly as few people as practicable, and where we do have to overfly communities, we look to provide noise sharing and noise respite opportunities.
Okay, but I've just looked it up. So there's Section 9 of your Act, is that right? You'd be more familiar with it than me. Section 9 of the Act apparently says that the protection of communities on the ground is one of your objectives or priorities. Is that right?
Yes, Senator. In performing our function, which is Section 9, our function is not to regulate what the airport decides to bring in. So we have to deal with and minimise the effect of what gets presented to us. That's the difference.
I mean, okay, so what part of the Act would stop you from saying there should be a cap on the number of flights in certain hours? Tell me what exactly part of the Act would stop that happening.
I think it's perhaps not a matter that it would stop us. We have no power to do that. But
you have the power to tell them you can only fly in this way and that way. Why can't you tell them you can only fly this many times?
We're required Airservices functions are for the safety, regularity and efficiency of air navigation, and underneath that sort of very broad heading is a range of rules around the way that we manage access to airspace, and we don't prohibit access to airspace. If a pilot requests a clearance and we can safely do so, we provide a clearance.
But how do you factor Section 9 into
through flight path design and our operations.
Why is only flight path design the tool and mechanism to meet Section 9? What part of your Act says that it's only through flight path design that you can do that?
In providing our services, and there's a list of services in Section 8, in delivering those, we have to make sure the safety of air navigation is the most important.
Completely understand, absolutely.
And then minimising, as far as practicable, the effects of the environment on the operations on the community. And so in everything we do, we're trying to minimise that. What we're getting into is restricting the number of aircraft that can arrive, or the demand that the airport would like to bring on, is getting into like a restraint of trade piece, which is beyond, rather than deal with. No.
So we don't decide. I mean, why don't we just let them fly wherever they want?
On that flight path. So we have.
It's a restraint on trade.
No.
You are earning your keep today.
All right. We do not have the ability to restrict any access to airspace. We have to manage whoever.
Yes, you do. You do it. You restrict access to airport space by saying that this is a flight path. The flight path is a restriction of airspace, right? You can't fly. If they said, look, I don't want that flight path, this one's less costly for me, I'm going to fly that way, you could fine them, right? if they're not on
I
the flight
can't
path?
find them.
Well, what's the sanction?
Well, the sanction is that there's no sanction from us. What we have to do is manage that traffic with the use of
I don't know much about that.
managing it to manage it safely.
You said, hang on, let's go back. You said that you manage the impacts of community by, well, there is only one at the
No,
moment.
there's only
One at a
one
time.
at a
Well,
time.
You're the second one. If you be quiet, there's only one.
All right, Matt, just please. I mean, as a chair, I'm just trying to manage the flow of traffic here, okay?
There's only
But
2 people
really-
interested in this committee right now.
Well, that's not true, but you need to allow the witness to also answer your question. So,
I'm just trying to get up to
We're here all
speed.
day.
I'm just trying to get up to
We're here
speed on
till
this
11
act because this is
Okay.
I've been not a resident of Brisbane,
It's
but
okay, Chair.
I became.
all is yours.
Well, it's exciting.
I became affected by the impact of people there. It's terrible what some people have had to go through.
Yeah.
And clearly, as you've admitted, partly due to the failure of government agencies to get their act in order. So the current act allows you said before, you partly help manage impacts on community by regulating flight paths. I'm just trying to understand if an airline decides, no, we're going to fly some other path, what can you do to make them go to the path you've decided?
So we issue an airways clearance, and we can reasonably require pilots to operate on particular routes. We need a reasonable rationale for requiring a flight to operate on a particular route over another route. Obviously. Our Act also requires us to foster and promote civil aviation, and so there are a number of expectations on Airservices as it relates to enabling the aviation industry.
Is flight paths mentioned in the Act at all?
Flight paths are perhaps a subservient part of
Can I just get a yes or no answer to that?
Yeah.
That's pretty simple. Are flight paths mentioned in the Act?
To my recollection, no, but there are a subset of elements that are mentioned in the Act.
But I'm just trying to understand here how, obviously, the Parliament's given you a broad responsibility to, as you say, Mr Harfield, absolutely number one, must be the safe operation of aircraft, primary consideration. And then also, but while in doing so, make sure there's, you limit to ameliorate the impact on communities. Can I take it that it's Airservices Australia that's decided that it'll be the flight paths that you regulate, that you set, that will ameliorate the impacts on communities? There's nothing in the Act or the Parliament said, do this by flight paths.
Correct, Senator.
Right.
Where there are other means, we will also.
Yeah, I'm just look, and it's obviously your decision. And as I say, I think if we're going to go down to something like caps, it'll probably have to be something by government. Government's obviously set curfews, etc., at different airports. But I just don't quite understand why you can't consider that as every other major piece of infrastructure, like ports, meatworks in my town, there are regulations on what they can do at night time for the community. And airports are a pretty big impact on a community. And don't understand why there shouldn't be some sort of regulation. I'm not saying a curfew per se, but something reasonable. All right. I might leave it there.
Thank you.
We've got more to go with this, though.